So last week, we looked at what it means to be a kingdom community. What is our purpose together? And this week, I want to look at it from an individual perspective. What is my purpose? And I actually want to look at it through the lens of work. Now, before I get talking about work too much, I realize that not everybody in this room works like a 9-to-5 job or works outside of the home. But I want us to think about work in a bigger context. Work isn't necessarily always paid work. It's not always outside of the home. Sometimes it's the things that we do with our time, like looking after children or another loved one, or it could be volunteering in our retirement or any other sort of thing that takes up a lot of our time. So Jesus makes some pretty demanding, or pretty large demands in our life. We have what we call the Great Commandment. In Matthew 22:37-40, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And so we might start to feel like we're living with a tension between Jesus' demands for all of us and all that we are, and the reality that we have to put food on the table, that we have to spend our time on something, particularly for those who actually have to work a job in order to support themselves or their family. So are we being pulled in two different directions? No, I think this is a false choice. Jesus isn't calling us to do pious things all day, like reading our Bible and praying. Those are good things. He's not calling us to full-time vocational ministry, leading Bible studies, preaching sermons, and doing pastoral visitation and stuff. All of those are good things, and we need to do those things, or some of us need to do those things. Rather, he's calling us to do all the stuff that we need to do anyways, like our jobs, in a different sort of way. Instead of thinking of God's work as being the churchy stuff that we do, we can think of God's work as being his representative in whatever place I find myself. So if that's at the office, then I can be God's representative at the office. If that's at home with my kids, I can be God's representative at home with my kids. It's not the place where we find ourselves that allows us to do God's work. It is the way that we do that work. When we represent God, we do the things that he's doing, and we communicate who he is to the people around us. Now, last week we talked about how the church is a community of this age to come, living in the midst of this present age. And so, if we want to understand what the life of the age to come is, paradoxically, we can look backwards. Because God created the world according to his good intentions, and it is by sin and selfishness that we have broken that world. And his desire is to restore it back to the original glory that he created it with. And so if we look at the story of Adam and Eve, we catch a window into the things that God desires us to do. One of the things that you might not expect to see in that original story is work. But in Genesis 2:15, we read, "The Lord took the man, Adam, and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and care for it." So work was always a part of God's plan for creation. But work was meant to be different than we experience it. Work was meant to be creative, life-giving, consequential, enjoyable, meaningful. And when Adam and Eve fall into sin, work stops being the thing that it was designed to be. And it can be, for some people, drudgery. It can be soul-destroying. That's not to say everybody has a bad job. I hope you all, for those who work jobs, that you enjoy it more than that. But it is to say that our work will never live up to God's expectation and design for it. After Adam falls into sin, God says to him, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food. So in other words, things aren't the way that they're meant to be. It's much harder to do the work that God designed for us to do in this sinful and broken world than it was meant to be. But we are called to take work back to its original intent. Now, this doesn't mean that we are all entitled to have dream jobs that we've always wanted, or that when our boss gives us a headache or something like that we are entitled to tell God that he needs to fix that thing for us. We still live in a broken and sinful world, and because of that, sometimes our work will be frustrating. But our work can be meaningful in an eternal context. If our work is merely about putting food on the table, then it doesn't really transcend our own purpose. But if our work is a participation in the things that God is doing in creation to redeem that creation to himself, then our work has eternal significance. And so our Monday to Friday job is a sacred calling. If you need a proof of this example, look no further than the life of Jesus. Jesus is likely a carpenter following after his father until around the age of 30 when he has a career change. And Paul in Colossians 2 calls Jesus the image of the invisible God. So Jesus represents God fully, but if he represents God fully, it's not just when he's preaching and teaching and performing miracles. It's also when he's working in the carpenter shop. God incarnate had a blue-collar job, and that part of his life, as much as any other part of his life, is a participation in God's work. So Jesus would show us what doing carpentry in a God-honoring and loving fashion looks like. Now, it doesn't really go into details about what that looked like, but we can imagine Jesus would have been conscientious in his work, creative. He would have had integrity. He would have used it to provide for his friends and family and the needy people around him. But of course, if this is true about Jesus and carpentry, then it stands to reason that it's true about the other things that we do as well. Can a person please God and serve him and follow him and represent him as a school teacher or a hairdresser or an office administrator or home builder or homemaker? Jesus shows us that our work is an opportunity to do God's work and to communicate who he is in every area where we find ourselves. Robert Banks wrote a book called Faith Goes to Work, and in it he interviews people who come from different career paths about how they apply the idea of the gospel into their everyday work. So he talks to a journalist, and the journalist says that God is about exposing truth. And so she tries to expose truth in her life. But she also realizes that there's also the newspaper's bottom line is a consideration to the people who run the newspaper, and there's always a temptation to shade what she says to try and make that more of a priority. But she says that in order to do her work faithfully, she has to instead stand up for communicating truth. He interviews a technology worker who says that he gets to practice creativity. And of course, God is the ultimate creator. And so when we create things, we are participating with God in what he's doing. But he also understands that in the technology industry, sometimes the creative things that we do can also lead to unintended consequences. We all know people who spend way too much time on their phones or on Facebook, and their lives are impoverished by it. And so we understand, or this fellow understands, that when he does his work, he's engaging in God's creativity, but he also needs to be careful of how he does his work so that unintended consequences don't pop up. He talks to a real estate developer who tries to figure out how to design neighborhoods to facilitate community. In the last 2 or 3 generations, there's been a move just in the way that houses and neighborhoods are designed to enhance privacy at the expense of community. So he's choosing to buck the trend And instead of giving people more and more reason to retreat into their fenced-off backyards, he's giving people more and more reason to go out into the streets in front of their houses, knowing that they'll have more opportunities to meet people and love people in that way. And so all of these are examples of people who don't work in a church or a parachurch organization and yet find deep spiritual meaning in the work that they do. Banks points out that there are sort of 6 characteristics that we can see in God's work that we can then see that transfers into human work. The first is that God's work is redeeming. So God is about ending conflicts and pointing people back to himself, and when our work does that, we're participating with God in his redemption. So you could think of a person who is a person who mediates conflicts, or it could be a lawyer who could do that. There's creative work. That's where God obviously his first action is creation, and he tells us to subdue the world. In a sense, he leaves it unfinished so that we can participate with him in creativity. And so a person who participates in this creative enterprise is participating with God in his work. So you could be a singer or songwriter or artist, but it could also be somebody like an engineer who creatively solves problems. God's work is providential. God provides for our needs. And if what I do provides a thing or a service to another person that they need, then I am participating with God in his providence, in his provision, I should say. Also, if you make money from your work, then you have a resource that you can steward. You can provide for your family with that. You can provide for your community, for people in need around you, for your church. You have the opportunity to provide for others. Then pretty much any job is like that. Then you can participate in the work that God is doing. God's work is just. When our work involves standing up for the marginalized, or when it helps to maintain justice, then you can be participating with God. So that might be a judge or a police officer. God's work is compassionate. We as his creation are rebellious, and yet he shows us kindness regardless. And if your job leads you to show kindness to people, particularly strangers, then your work can participate in God's compassionate ministry. This might be work as a nurse. And then God's work is revelatory. He promises that the truth sets us free. So if your work exposes truth, then you're participating in what God does. That could be as a journalist or as a scientist. So it's not what we do, it's how we do it. Now, there are a couple of careers I could think of that are not honoring to God no matter what you do. It's hard to think of a God-honoring way to deal drugs, for instance. But for most of us, I would hope, this is not the problem that we face. For most of us, the issue isn't that we're doing a job that's incompatible with the kingdom of God. For most of us, the issue is we have a choice to make about how we do the job that we're doing. Do we do that job in a way that looks to God and says, what is God doing and how can I participate in that in the midst of this job that I have? Or do we simply go with the flow with everybody else? I have a friend who was a social worker, and he was told that he needed to keep his professional distance from the kinds of people that social workers work with, which are typically people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And so he thought about it and said, well, Jesus doesn't keep his professional distance, does he? Jesus becomes a human being. He moves into the neighborhood. And so my friend, following Jesus' example, moved into a low-rent apartment building and built relationships with the people all around him. And he got fired for it. Because sometimes the values of this world and the values of God's kingdom don't play well together. And so when we desire to do what God is doing, to participate with him in the areas where we work, we have to resolve to do it for an audience of one. What God thinks matters. What everybody else around me says can't matter more than that. So we decide, or we understand that we have a calling. No matter where you find yourself, you have a calling. Os Guinness says that calling is the truth that God has called us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, and everything that we have is invested with a special devotion and dynamism, lived out of a response to his summons and service. So in other words, God has given us so much. He has done so much for us that we take everything that we have and everything that we are and we respond to his love and goodness. In other words, we are sent by God into the world as missionaries. The word missionary comes from the Latin word that means to send. And so, Jesus calls us to go into the world, not necessarily overseas, but he tells us to go into the world, into whatever places we find ourselves, as God's emissary, as his representative. When I was in my mid-20s, I was a missionary. I moved to Hungary. I raised support from my church back home and other people that I knew, and I did Christian things. But I think my mistake in all of that was thinking that I was a missionary because I was somewhere else, and because I was doing Christian things for a living. In the decade or so after I got back from that, I realized what it was to be a Christian photographer, and a missionary photographer, and a missionary hotel marketing director. And the year that Carolyn went back to work after Naomi was born, I learned what it was to do missionary childcare. It's not what we do, it's the way that we do it that allows us to find purpose and meaning. God calls us to love him. We love him by serving him, by representing him, by participating in the things that he's doing. And wherever you find yourself, if you're finding yourself at an office, in a workshop, if you find yourself at home looking after your loved ones, you are at work and you have an opportunity to make that work a missionary endeavor. That is the call that God's put on me. That's the call that God has put on you. What will you do with the call?